Good morning. Well, at least it is for me, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to the channel. And today we're going to be doing our 19th Bible contradiction. And as usual, you guys can find me on Facebook, YouTube, One Way, or on BitChute. But ladies and gentlemen, I wish to warn you, those of you who are using BitChute or who wish to use BitChute, please understand the following. BitChute is obscenely unreliable. Okay, so BitChute will not always have all of the videos which I've prepared, or even the latest videos which I've prepared, because BitChute seems to decide when it feels like it that it will retrieve my videos from YouTube, and it will decide when it feels like that it will upload. When it fails to do that, right? Then I'm forced to upload the video myself manually directly to BitChute, and at that point sometimes it decides it's going to let me to do so, sometimes it isn't, and sometimes then those of you who do it, it goes once it's uploaded, there's a period of processing before it publishes it, and that sometimes can sit for 3 or 4 days, nothing happens, in which case I have to delete it and re-upload it, and sometimes I just can't get it to happen. I've just battled with the video this week, so for those of you that use BitChute, I'm very sorry. I wish BitChute was better. I really do, but it's utterly unreliable. So if you want my latest stuff, you will always find it on YouTube, because despite all of the problems with YouTube, it is currently the most reliable platform on the market, and it is what it is. I'm very sorry. So today we're going to be talking, ladies and gentlemen, about the 19th Bible contradiction. The 19th Bible contradiction is as follows. It says, how old was Ahaziah? Remember the 20th, because they repeated a question, so the numbers don't necessarily correspond. Just to remind you, for those who become unnecessarily peevish with certain things, or who are coming in, haven't watched the first videos, I will try to always remind you of that. How old was Ahaziah when he began to reign? Here's king, and these are the verses, the corresponding verses. So right, let's go to the verses and let's have a look at what they say. It says here 2 and 20 years. So at 22 years old, Ahaziah was Ahaziah when he began to reign, and he reigned 1 year in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Athaliah, the daughter of Omri, king of Israel. This is actually important in deciphering this particular Bible contradiction. And over here it says 42 years old was Ahaziah when he began to reign, and he reigned, and so on and so forth. So there is clearly a big problem, because 42, right, and 22 are a clear issue, right? A clear problem. 42 and 22 don't add up at all. And if you are reading, for example, I'm using the King James version over here. The reason I use King James version is because copyright, etc. It's, I'm not one of those King James only people, but it's not right. So this Bible contradiction will only show up in some Bible verses, Bible translations. Only in some Bible translations. We need to be aware of that. So in your New American Standard Version and so on and so forth, some of the newer ones where the work of translation and the manuscript work has sort of improved somewhat, these errors are corrected and they are sorted out there. And in order to discern what's going on here, one has to go to the original. Right? One has to go to the original. So this one actually gets a bit tricky, because if you're using some of your older translations like the King James Version and you're just reading it plainly there, it's going to look like, well, 22 and 42 clearly don't add up, okay? You're 20 years off, okay? Now, first thing, right, again, in the way that Christians treat the Bible, right, when we talk about inerrancy and all that kind of stuff, the position is not that you're never going to find any contradictions or anything like that, in sort of the finer details of the texts, that copyists can't make mistakes and stuff like that. That is not the Christian position. There are many who take that stance. It's a nonsensical stance. You cannot support that stance. But the Christian, the long-standing, right, so this is a long-standing position, is that We talk about the tenacity of the scriptures, that through all of the years, the essence and the doctrines and the teachings of the Bible have been preserved, and whatever errors there are do not in fact affect the essence and the meaning, etc., etc., of the verses and of what the doctrines are trying to say. So if we look at this particular contradiction, was he 22 or was he 42? This does not affect any doctrine, any Christian doctrine whatsoever. So we can actually see, if we look back to, we're now contradiction number 19. Up till now, I think only one or two contradictions were could potentially have affected some kind of doctrine, but in the vast majority of these cases, they do not affect any doctrine whatsoever. They do not change the meaning of the verse or the scripture or the context that they're in. Doesn't change the meaning, does not affect the essence of what it's trying to say in any way, shape, or form. So anyone that wants to be peevish about these particular contradictions is basically just being an idiot. Okay. It's not actually a problem, and it's not a problem for Christians. It is a problem for those who really sort of, how do you say, those like Southern Baptist types that really, there's no subtlety in anything they do, right? Maybe I'm being unfair. Southern Baptists, they're not all that way. Some of them are a bit more subtle and stuff like that. But there's this Bible Belt in America type of Christianity that is just really narrow-minded and really like, yeah, right? Okay, so that being said, this is actually a very, very interesting little problem here. Now, if we go to the verse here, specifically Chronicles, right? Now, what we have eventually realized with studying the text and stuff like that is that both texts, right, Chronicles and Kings, should say 20 and 2 years old. So if you go to other translations, both verses will say 22 years old. So where does the 42 come from? If you go to the original texts, right, there are some texts that have the word 42 rather than 22. But if we go to the verse here, right, if we go to the verse here in Chronicles, it says here, 40 and 2 years old was Ahaziah. Now, in the old texts, in the ancient texts, where you have the 40, where you have the 42, it does not have the word was. Right, and this is significant. It basically all it says, the son of 42 began to reign, Ahaziah. So basically what happens is, if we actually look at the genealogy, we realize that Ahaziah, his mother's name was Athaliah, right, daughter of Omri. We realize if we do the genealogy or the lineage of this particular dynasty, we realize that Omri began to reign 42 years before Ahaziah. So the 42 quite most likely refers to the beginning of this particular dynasty, right? So over here in Kings, it chronicles Ahaziah's age himself, right, when he himself, the individual, began to reign. And over here it's chronicling when Ahaziah began to reign relative to the dynasty of his particular family. So it's less concerned with Ahaziah, the individual's age, but more with he began to reign in the 42nd year of the dynasty of the kings of this particular family after Omri. Okay, so that is most likely what is actually going on here, right? Most likely what is actually going on here. That is one possibility. So it could be, so the one is talking about his personal age. The other one is talking about how many years after the start of the dynasty from his forefather Omri to him beginning to reign. So he began to reign 42 years into the dynasty, right? And he was 22 years old at that particular time. That is one explanation, and that is most likely what they are intending to chronicle when we look at those particular ancient texts. Now, other texts do list it as 22, right? And so what another possibility, right, could be that it was that it was actually a copyist error. Okay, so whoever was making the copies and stuff like that, in some of the ancient manuscripts, they made a bugger up, and there was a copyist error, sort of, as the sort of thing. And we can see here something very, very interesting. Why would it be so easy to confuse? Because if we're writing in our English language, 42 and 22 are, whether you write it out or whether you numerically, or whether you actually spell it out, completely different. But if we actually look at the Hebrew, we see something a little bit different, right? So here we have what the writing would have been in Hebrew. So if we look at 22, so 22 is that symbol there. So basically those two symbols there, right? Now if we look at 42, it's those two symbols there. So you can see it would be quite easy for a copyist, if he was a little bit sleepy or whatever, to actually bugger up. So you have that one there and that one there. You can see that it's only one symbol really that separates the two, and it's very, very easy to, depending on what the copier is copying from, it can be very, very easy to actually mess that up, to mess that number up. And so that's possibly one of the reasons why we actually have an issue over there, is there was a copyist error, and he made a little bit of a bugger up over there, and so on and so forth. And then because we have such a proliferation of manuscripts, right? Now here's something we need to understand when it comes to how do Christians know or establish the truth of the Bible. Here's an interesting principle that is actually very, very important for us to understand. How does God actually attempt to preserve his word, right? Because a lot of people make this sort of straw man fallacy, and you find, for example, people like Bart Ehrman make this problem where they say, well, if it's the word of God, God should have somehow preserved it in its absolute perfect original state, 100% from the beginning, and we should still have that today. First of all, that's completely ridiculous. It's total nonsense, and you are assuming you know how God would actually go about doing these things. How the text was proliferated in the early church, there's a couple of things that we need to understand. First of all, the Christians were under severe persecution, right? And as a result, their texts were also sort of banned, and all these kinds of things, burnt, and all that sort of thing. So one of the main ways to preserve the gospel and stuff like that is, for early Christianity, there was no interest in having a central authority which totally dictated what would be preserved or what would not be preserved, right? It was the Christian intent in the early church to basically spread the message as rapidly as possible, so anyone could copy, right? You could make a copy, and that it was just supposed to spread like wildfire. And so that's what you have in the early church. You have this massive explosion of texts of being copied and all kinds of things all over the world, right? And as the church spread, and then there was a lot of persecution and stuff. So if there was a central authority, right, and this is the providence of God, if there had been a central authority for the scriptures, it would have been very, very easy for the enemies of Christianity to go and target that single authority and then wipe out, and we would never have the Bible again. But in this method of promulgating the texts like wildfire, just thousands and thousands of copies just everywhere, right? It would have been absolutely impossible for any enemy of the gospel or of the Bible to completely eradicate the Bible in its entirety. Would have been completely and utterly impossible. Now, one of the costs that you pay is that some of they're going to be textual variances, not only necessarily in copyist error, but also depending on the dialects and stuff. So, for example, you can have the same word written in several different ways depending on dialects and colloquialisms and all of these kinds of things as the language is spread out, and so on and so forth. But then the benefit of what you've got is that you've got thousands of texts which are then available for us down the generations. We need to understand, right? The Bible is the greatest is the single greatest attested document on the planet, right? We have literally thousands upon thousands of Bible texts, ancient Bible texts in all kinds of different languages, ancient languages, and so on and so forth, just all over the place, right? We need to understand that. Unlike any other ancient text on the planet, when you talk to historians, when they're dealing with texts, they are very, very excited if they have one or two sources. Really, that's how bad the situation is, right? They're very, very excited if they have only one or two sources. Whereas when you come to the Bible, you literally have thousands. Okay, you've got thousands of manuscripts. And so a lot of people are like, well, there's thousands of manuscripts. How can you possibly know what the original is? The original has been lost. That's totally idiotic, because first of all, no one really makes this argument when it comes to ancient writings of any other historical figure whatsoever. People don't make this argument, and when they do, then they're basically shooting themselves in the foot, because then there is no way of establishing what we have today from Socrates or Plato or any of those ancient philosophers. We have no way of saying, well, that is the original of what they spoke. So you kind of shoot yourself in the foot, where basically anyone, if they want to take that position, anyone can just dismiss them. But here's the benefit of the Bible. Let's say you've got a puzzle. You've got to figure out the puzzle, right? What is the most ideal situation to have when you are trying to figure out the image? Because a puzzle, once you've assembled the puzzle, you have a picture, right? What's the most ideal way to establish what the picture is? Is it to have, let's say it's a 1,000-piece puzzle, okay? Which is the most ideal situation? Is it to have only 2 pieces, or 3 pieces, or 4 pieces, or 10 pieces of a 1,000-piece puzzle? Or is it better to have 1,005 pieces, or 1,100 pieces? Is it better to have more pieces than you actually need? Or is it better to have significantly fewer pieces than what you actually need, right? It's obviously better if you have significantly more pieces than you actually need in order to establish what the original picture looked like. And this is precisely what we have when it comes to the Bible, right? We have more than we need in order to establish and trace what the original texts said. So the original, contrary to what a lot of people say, the original is not lost. The original was preserved within the body of what we call the cloud of witnesses. So basically, have a look at a principle that comes out in the Bible. I just pulled up a verse. It says here, 1 witness shall not rise up against a man for any iniquity or for any sin. In any sin that he sinneth, at the mouth of 2 witnesses or at the mouth of 3 witnesses shall the matter be established. So we see here already an insight into how God thinks. God is never been interested in a central authority. One central authority that's just going to completely dominate everything, right? God always had many prophets, many people that worked for him, that a lot of the times were not part of the main dominating sort of sometimes they were kings, were part of the establishment of a central core. Sometimes they weren't. Sometimes the prophets were persecuted by the people. So God has never been interested in preserving things through just one person. He's always been interested in a cloud of witnesses. And we see the same, that God uses or continues the trend when it comes to the establishment of the biblical doctrine, where it was his preference or his intention to rather have more texts than needed, variations and copyist errors aside, have all of that out there rather than one single authority. Because the problem with, like I said, the problem with one single authority is that the enemies of the faith could easily seek out that single authority, destroy it, burn all the books and everything like that, and in that manner very easily target and destroy and dispose of the faith. And 2, when you have centralization, you can then get corruption. So you can then have political biases, because a lot of people say, or love to say, that the Bible is just a political text that is meant to control the masses and all, and that is clearly absolute utter trash, right? Utter trash. And we know that's utter trash precisely because of how the texts were propagated, how the gospel was sent forth into the world. It was never by one central authority initially. It became so much later, once Rome or the Byzantine Empire became Christianized. You had a central Christian authority and all that kind of stuff, and then there was a lot of battle between East and West. And when we look at the troubles between the Holy Roman See and the Byzantine Empire, where you have centralized centers of authority and stuff like that, you then see exactly the problem of what happens when you try to concentrate authority all into one place. Not so much with the Byzantines, because the Eastern Orthodox Church does the correct thing, in which they don't believe in a centralized pope or a centralized authority, but all of the different churches under so you've got the Eastern Orthodox, you've got the Greek Orthodox, you've got the Serbian Orthodox, etc., and there's no one telling the other one what to do. And in that way, if there is a corruption in one place, then the other place, all of the other bishops and all that kind of stuff can sort of then correct them. Unlike the Holy Roman Catholic Church, which you've got one central authority, and if that one central authority becomes corrupted, that's it. It's just downhill from there. And we see that in the Holy Roman Empire, where there was the erection of one central authority under the Pope, who was basically Christ on earth. And it just went downhill from there, just completely downhill from there, and it was just absolute nonsense. And that is how the God intends to preserve. So when you actually look at how the Bible, first of all, God's intention for how it would be spread and how it's spread and how we can know with all these kinds of things, we then see that this idea that it was meant to be one authority for brainwashing people, absolute trash. It completely dispels a whole bunch of myths and a whole bunch of nonsense. So, ladies and gentlemen, in order to establish that this is a contradiction, right, the person making the objection would have to establish one of two things: a, that whatever copyist error, if that in the case of a copyist error, that error actually goes back to the original, first of all, sort of thing, to say it's a contradiction. And they would and which they can't do. It would be very, very difficult to, especially because the detractors of the Bible say that we don't know what the original said. Okay, so if they themselves say that we cannot possibly know what the original said, that the original is lost, then they can actually not make that the case, that the error, it was in the original, that the contradiction was in the original. So they can't actually make that case. That case is not available to them, sort of the Bart Ehrmans of the world and stuff like that. Also, they would have to show, in order for this to be of any significance, that they would have to show that it actually destroys some of the essence of the Bible, that it destroys, that it interferes with doctrine, which they cannot do. There's no doctrine that rests upon how old the guy was at all. And B, they would have to show that in the case where it's 42 rather than 22, that they're actually referring that they're actually making a mistake, they're mistaking Ahaziah's age rather than reckoning the distance the time distance of his dynasty, rather than reckoning his age. They would have to show those things, and they wouldn't be able to. Basically, they wouldn't actually be able to do that, and as far as I'm aware, they don't bother to do that, because the typical atheist thing is to just throw up, as long as it's apparently a contradiction, they just throw it up and say, oh, there's a contradiction, and that's it, right? They just complain, and that's it, and then people in an unthinking way just go with it, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, depending on the text that you're reading, yes, there is a contradiction, right? So if you're reading King James, there is a problem there. The problem can be resolved by consulting original manuscripts. But yeah, that will depend on the translation you're reading. Some translations it's different, and some translations it's not. And in the translations where it is different, it might still not necessarily be a contradiction, because We don't know whether it's talking about the age of the guy's dynasty when he started, or if it's actually referring to the guy's individual age. And unless you establish that, you can't actually establish a contradiction. So that one is a bit of a gray area. You can't really say yay or nay, but if we look at it, we can say that even if it is a total contradiction, it's completely irrelevant. Totally irrelevant. It's not a problem. It's not a problem for any Christian that has a sober and educated view of Scripture and how it is transmitted, and about the issues with copying and manuscripts and stuff, and how we actually know and formulate the canon, right? Not those people picketing and who go off about King James only and all that kind of nonsense, right? Those people, can't do anything about them. I'm sorry. And I think most of the time, this is the problem. Those King James only types, sort of your hysterical Christian type, right? Your hysterical Christian type. Those are the ones with the loudest voices. So usually when atheists make these stupid responses, right, where there's no subtlety, there's no nothing of that particular sort, usually it's because they're responding to those types of Christians, right? The noisy hysterical types, right? Because their arguments are shallow and narrow-minded. Therefore, then the atheist response will typically be similar, the same, which is a problem. But these things are actually a lot more nuanced than that. And it would be nice if atheists could consult the sober-minded side of Christianity rather than the hysterical, fanatical, ridiculous types that just like to just be so narrow-minded. I mean, if I think about the narrow-mindeds, literally just the past 2 days, I shared something on my Facebook page, some Christian guy page, and I had this one Christian just come up, and just the narrow-mindedness was unbelievable, just unbelievable. Fancies himself philosophically switched on and stuff like that, constantly shifting the burden of responsibility, constantly skirting the issues. When I said, listen, if you have an issue, just articulate what your problem is. Refused to do that, just utterly refused to do that, kept on saying, oh, well, you have to state why you... It's like, no, you're the one making the objection, right? If you make the objection, you have to formulate your argument. You have to state why a certain thing is, right? But you get this problem on both sides. You get it on Christians, you get it on atheists. The atheists will jump it down, oh, here's a problem. It's like, no. Don't just say it's a problem. Articulate why you think it's a problem. And if you either for or against, if you're making a positive statement about something, whether for or against, then the burden of responsibility rests upon you to articulate and justify and substantiate why you are making that claim. So when I shared this video, I literally just shared the video. This guy says some good stuff, eat the meat, spit out the bones kind of stuff. And this guy went off on me like, and I'm like, listen, I didn't make I just shared it. I made no statements, no whatever. But if you want to have a conversation, tell me precisely what it is you want to talk about, and then we can get into it. Flat out refused, and it was just assertion after assertion, no subtlety, nothing. So I understand why atheists get annoyed with Christians. There's a very, very narrow-minded, very, very knee-jerk reaction type of very I think I know more than I actually do attitude that just irritates everyone, and makes proper discourse and the move forward almost impossible. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that is that video for all done. I thank you all for your viewership, and I will spot you all later. Thank you, and God bless, and cheerio.